Before we get going, I'd like to give you a quick reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You will not regret subscribing to our YouTube channel. To do that, you click the subscribe button at the bottom of your screen and also tap the bell icon to make sure you get reminders and never, ever miss an episode. Now, Vladimir Putin is selling his war in Russia as a war just not against the Ukraine, but against a spiritually decadent and bankrupt West, a Western world that we all live in, that is obsessed with gender debates, the denial of biological reality, and drag queens and LGBTQ issues, and so on. Lionel Shriver, our brilliant columnist, has a column in this week where she says the problem here is that Vladimir Putin has a point. Lionel joins me now alongside the writer Rob Henderson. Lionel, why does Vladimir Putin have a point?
Well, if nothing else, we are obsessing about things that are in the big picture small. And so it's distracting us from solving bigger problems. But I would also maintain that something like the transgender movement is significant. It doesn't pertain to that many people, although it does affect the way our children are being educated. But its significance really has to do with the denial of reality. And when you start denying reality, well, there's no natural limit, is there? I mean, if I were the former Soviets, I couldn't come up with anything better than the package of obsessions that we've come up with. And in the column, I mean, which I have to admit is something of a rant. It's a set of positions and attitudes that really come down to a self-dislike, a kind of burgeoning fifth column within the West that is destroying itself. And, you know, one of those elements is the obsession with net zero, which is looking as if it's going to be quite a minority obsession, especially when it comes down to actually doing something about it rather than talking. Talk is cheap. But if only the West really gets on board, even assuming that all the climate change activists are correct, you know, it's just, all the sacrifice is not going to make any difference. And again, you know, if the Russians were to come up with an ideology that would be perfectly designed to impede and even defeat the West, this is perfect. You know, we're busy trying to convert to a technology we don't even have yet, really, and to make everything electric before we actually have the means of generating that electricity. I mean, it's completely insensible. And 80% of the world's energy is still based on fossil fuels. And we're acting as if, you know, virtually tomorrow we can live without them. Just across the board, you know, Freddie, you sent me a really interesting clip of a Soviet dissident who defected in 1985, talking about how the KGB primarily had been trying to subvert the U.S. not through spying, but through ideological corruption. And it's almost as if that's what they've been doing. I mean, I feel as if, you know, I calling it woke now is insufficient. We're all sick of the word anyway. And it's just too small and too cute. This is something deep and terrible. I mean, this whole thing of having rejected meritocracy and now awarding all kinds of positions to people just because of what race or sex or sexual orientation they have. I mean, that is a recipe for self-destruction.
Yes. And Rob, it's not just Russia, is it? I mean, a lot of other countries are starting to see the West, America, and its allies in this way. China does to a certain extent. The BRIC countries do. And in fact, a lot of these countries in their various international conferences and so on talk about a geopolitical tipping point where American hegemony is coming to an end and we're moving into a multilateral world. And it's obvious to them that the culture wars, if you like, are a sign of Western weakness. And indeed, that they may even be trying at some level to stoke it. Have you seen any evidence of other countries trying to stoke the culture wars in order to prove that the West is in decline?
Sure. I mean, there have been some interesting pieces, especially during the riots and the demonstrations of 2020 of China developing bots and hiring individuals to post online on social media accounts to stoke contentious debate and to troll people and to essentially sort of cultivate hostility and animosity between Americans. And this is in their interest to do so. I mean, one of the things that Lionel pointed out in her column, which I found fascinating, was the body positivity point. I mean, this is something that this finding has been shown in multiple outlets. The New York Times recently covered this, but I'm still shocked at how little attention it has received, which is that the Pentagon recently released a survey showing that 8 out of 10 young Americans are ineligible to enlist in the military, primarily due to issues of obesity, physical and mental health issues, criminal records, and so on. So if 80% of young people aren't eligible to enlist, I mean, that in itself shows a sort of significant cultural decline. And we seem to not be so interested in what's going on with young people if we are to go to enter some kind of conflict with Russia or any other country, whether to support Ukraine or anyone else. It seems that we should be focusing on what has happened to young people, and instead we'd rather talk about body positivity and some of the other issues that Lionel points out.
Lionel, I was speaking to an admiral in the French Navy recently who was quite concerned. He wasn't a sort of right-wing lunatic by any means, but he was quite concerned about young people in France, and he talked about French people, he talked about British people and Americans too, and a lack of willingness, if it came to it, to actually fight. Do you think this taps into what we're talking about here, that Western people have sort of given up on our own culture or on what we are meant to believe in?
I think when the war in Ukraine started, there were some polls done of Americans anyway, and whether or not they would fight for their country, and the figures were appalling. I mean, very few. And that's what we're talking about, a kind of this package of distractions as well as self-doubting attitudes.
There was a recent, if I can just say, there was a recent
Yes.
finding from Jean Twenge's new book, Generations. She outlines the sort of characteristic differences of the generations in the US. And one shocking finding that she pointed out, and I wrote about this in the Free Press, which is something like 47% of Gen Z young adults say that America's founders are more accurately described as villains rather than heroes. Now, I know that if you're talking to British people, maybe they have some interesting thoughts about that. But at least young Americans thinking that the founders of their own country, nearly half of young Americans viewing the founders of their own country this way. I think this is indicative of something clearly going wrong with the youth.
Yeah, it's a deep demoralization, and you can trace it back a couple of generations. It's been going on for a long time, but rather than just run its course, it seems to be gathering steam, and it's deadly on every level. And I think that there's very little to substitute for it in a positive way. all of the passions are negative. They're all filled with dread. I don't even think that there is a consuming, vivid vision of an ideal future that is powering younger people. A utopianism, where we're all going to be equal and there will be no more racism, and there's no gender roles, and we're all just ourselves. I mean, you can kind of put together that picture, but basically what's in these people's head, as far as I can tell, is very dark, very dark. Nothing but dread, and also an eagerness to put off adulthood. And of course, fighting for your country, that's the ultimate in adulthood. The weird embrace of not just of mental illness itself, but an eagerness to have a diagnosis of some sort, and the competition over effectively who's weaker, which is what the whole victimhood thing is about. Who can be weaker? Who can be more oppressed and therefore more powerless? I don't think all young people are like this. I don't. But we don't hear from the people who aren't like this very much.
Yes. Rob, I was going to ask you, to what extent are we just beating up ourselves unnecessarily? Because while there's no doubt that Vladimir Putin wants to stoke up the culture, wants to stoke up the resentment of social conservatives and Christians in Western countries, he's not the ideal ambassador of sort of the moral good. I mean, it's perfectly obvious to most Russians with a brain that he is himself a corrupt and almost certainly murderous figure.
Right. Well, just as sometimes good people have bad ideas, sometimes bad people can make good points. And I think in this case, in this instance, he's made some astute critiques. Often your enemies, your adversaries can be quite good at pointing out your shortcomings and your inadequacies in ways that friends can't or won't, because your friends have an interest in flattering you or buttering you up, or perhaps overlooking some of your flaws, whereas your enemies can be very good at pinpointing where you're coming up short. And in this case, he has pointed out a lot of flaws that Westerners themselves have been speaking about for a long time. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if Putin himself was sort of reading a lot of the conservative columnists and commentators and just generally social critics across the social spectrum in order to understand what's going on in America and in the West more generally, and sort of harvesting the most astute critiques. As Lionel pointed out in that piece, there are so many things going wrong in the country, and primarily seems to be led by members of the cultural and economic elite. I coined this term a few years ago, luxury beliefs, ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And there are a variety of different examples, some that Lionel had pointed out. Body positivity was one that we had mentioned earlier, the net zero issue. A lot of the attacks and critiques on merit as well. All of these things do serve to make the people who are at or near the apex of the social ladder look interesting. It makes them look unconventional and gives them it confers a sort of status to them among their peers. But ultimately, when these ideas spread throughout society or when they're implemented into policy, these can have detrimental effects, not only for the people within the country, but perhaps, ultimately could potentially destabilize the world order if we're unable to stand up to villains like Putin.
Also, I'd add that this whole miasma of beliefs is contagious. And if I were Putin, I'd actually be a little afraid of it. If there's any, previously the Soviets were trying to corrupt the American culture, but American culture is now capable of corrupting other cultures. And I'm afraid that I have lived in the UK during the period that the UK has become infected it is a kind of illness, and it spreads very rapidly, and the UK is now sick. It's sick with it, and it's obviously it's spread throughout the Anglosphere, and I feel confident it is spreading into continental Europe. The French like to think that they are immune to it, but they're not. It's already there. It's already in pockets. It's already fashionable in universities.
There's been some interesting research lately within the U.S. on young people who grow up in primarily English-speaking households versus immigrant households in which English is not the dominant language. And what was interesting there is that young people who don't speak English are actually happier and have score higher on life satisfaction and are generally less anxious and less depressed than children who are raised with English in the household. And one possible interpretation of this is that when you're relentlessly exposed to American culture, English-speaking media, and so forth, this actually does demoralize you and sort of undermine your sense of confidence and well-being. Whereas if you are not consuming so much English-speaking content and you're sort of in your little ethnic enclave in pockets that are sort of isolated from American culture, that may actually be better for your mental health and well-being.
But not Spectator TV, I should add.
Sure.
But
right.
Lionel, lastly, actually, I'll ask both of you this question. Lastly, a lot of Christians see this phenomenon. They see progressivism as a sort of substitute religion. A lot of non-Christians starting to regard it as a substitute religion. I wondered to what extent you blame what's happening on the decline of Christianity in the Western Hemisphere and the decline of sort of ideas of truth and so on. And are we running out of the kind of moral capital that religion gave us for so long?
That's become a kind of standard. I don't want to accuse you of saying things that are cliches.
No, it's all right.
It has become a cliche, actually, that the whole explanation for the rage of progressivism has to do with the fact that we don't have established religion to nearly the degree we used to, and that there is some kind of religious need psychologically in people that will fasten on to something in lieu of having a well-defined faith. They'll find something else, and there's clearly something to that. My frustration on that point is that I was raised as a Presbyterian, and I didn't fancy being Presbyterian from about the age of 8. And I don't like to think that the only alternative to being crazed with progressive, excessive thoughts is necessarily another set of beliefs, some of which are a little weird and depend on stories that I regard as a little dubious. Why do we have to have either an established religion, which, of the sort that I rejected when I was a kid, or you have to go nuts politically? I mean, surely there's a way of believing in something and having principles and having some faith, not uncritical, but some faith in your own society and in your own future. Why do you have to believe something stupid necessarily? Is there some genetic need to believe fairy stories of some sort? I don't think so. I don't think that's the only way.
Well, at the risk of seeming delicate, I wouldn't necessarily say fairy stories, but Robert, I think maybe what I was trying to get at is relativism. Does seem to be the moral universe post-Christianity in the West, and relativism is very susceptible to the progressivism we're talking about that is destructive and that does make people very unhappy and self-harming.
Right. Well, I think there was a brief period of relativism in the 20th century as religion was on the wane, and relativism was a useful instrument to undermine people's belief in religion. But I actually do think that to some extent people need to have some sort of overarching belief. It doesn't, I'm not sure if it necessarily has to be religious or political, but they need belief in something, whether it's a sort of a civic culture or belief in some kind of stable traditional values or some kind of confidence in the country and in its customs. But in the absence of any sort of moral order, people, sort of moral entrepreneurs can step in and start to tell people what they should be thinking or what they should be feeling or what they should be believing. And so after a prolonged period of relativism, some political activists stepped in and sort of gave people a list of ideas that they should be believing in and a list of norms that they should be adhering to. And a lot of people had no argument against it, and they were susceptible to it. And I think that is at least part of the story of what has happened, especially as religion has declined. It's possible that we can step out of this, but we would need to have some kind of story to replace it. I don't think that people can exist in a period of total moral relativism.
Yeah, the trouble with moral relativism and also with this progressive package, they both slide denialism. I mean, that's what I was talking about. The progressive package doesn't really have any positive content. And you were talking, Rob, about, something to believe in, which is not just believing what is bad, but also what is good. And that's really what's missing. It's all dark. And therefore, it's right next door to nothing matters. Everything is meaningless. Life is stupid. We might as well be dead. I mean, it's not a big step.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was in school, it wasn't that long ago, the 90s and the 2000s, there was still a general, at least the school system that the public school system in California, that there was this belief that the founding fathers were generally good, that Abraham Lincoln was good, George Washington. And, of course, we got the sort of simplified, maybe the fairy tale version of the American founding, but it was still something that kids could generally unite around and believe in and have confidence in. And now we're in the era of tear down all the statues, and Abraham Lincoln actually wasn't such a good guy, or he was actually just as bad as the Confederacy. And so now, even if you look at patriotism or confidence in the country, those things are rapidly declining. And so naturally, what's left? Oh, well, there's the net zero, the climate change campaign. There's maybe you can change your gender. Maybe there are X, Y, and Z. All of these other sort of newfangled ideas that people can latch onto, and people can be awarded some kind of moral plaudits for it in a way that there's no other way to do so.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up there on that not tremendously cheerful note, but it's absolutely fascinating talking to you both. And thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV.